If you clicked on this video, you're trying to be different from everybody else and you don't want to be like the sheep that just waste all of their waiver wire pickups. Lucky for you, I'm going to steer you exactly away from all of that and give you guys the players that we do not need to be adding off the waiver wire because they are complete traps. We can't be wasting fab, we can't be wasting waiver wire priority, and this is the most crucial time in fantasy football around the trade deadline halfway through the season. So let's get it started. You guys know I hate to waste your time in these videos. The very first player everybody's picking up off the waiver wire that we cannot leave the traps to your league mates is Brandon Cooks. Yes, he's been having more hype recently. He's looking a little bit good. He had 15 fantasy points in 2 back-to-back games. Great, nice, fantasy points, cool. But no, his value has not changed at all in this Cowboys offense. His role, nothing has changed. The reason we go ahead and add players off the waiver wire is to stash people on our bench that we think could have some kind of startable value either now or later down the line of the season. And that will quite literally never happen for Brandon Cooks for a number of reasons. If I ever tell you to start Brandon Cooks in the future, check up on me, make sure I'm okay, and I'm still the real me, because I am never going to say that he should not be added off our waivers. We cannot start him. He hasn't increased his snap share at all in the season. He's been hovering around to 70% all year, and you can just look at his chart. He's only averaging about 5 targets a game, luckily with that 7 target game once. There's pretty much no green on this chart, and that is not good. And despite last week's matchup where the Cowboys put up 43 points on the Rams, Dak had over 300 passing yards, Brandon Cooks still only had 3 receptions. Now that wouldn't be that big of a deal because it was a blowout and he got a little bit less snaps along with everybody else, but Dak still had very good passing volume. 40 points were scored and 300 passing yards. He should have more value than that, and he really just does not get any kind of consistent target share. The only way Brandon Cooks would even be a flex spot for us is if he started to average 6, maybe 7, 8 targets a game. That is never going to happen. Even if CeeDee Lamb were to be injured for the remainder of the season, which is something we can't bank on, he would still just barely be startable. He's not a guy that's consistent. We don't need to be wasting a bench spot on him. The only reason he's even considering being a waiver wire add this week is because of his fantasy points, and they're really only inflated because of his 2 touchdowns in back-to-back weeks. We should instead be using our waiver wire for under the radar guys that could have value season long, or even right now, guys like Zach Charbonnet, Jahan Dotson, Trey McBride. There's a whole bunch of guys that we can add off the waiver wire this week that will give us very good season long value that we can start in our lineups. But another wide receiver here that is a complete trap on the waiver wire, I've been talking about it for a couple of weeks, that I just don't buy the hype in on. He's not going to be startable. He cannot be startable, is Rashid Shaheed. He's a guy that a lot of people can and will and are being excited about. He came out and had 150 yards on the day with 3 touchdowns, but let me explain why this means absolutely nothing and is fool's gold. Fantasy points at the end of the day is not necessarily indicative of a person's fantasy value. We've seen this many times before. Yes, he had 24 fantasy points and had a whole bunch of yardage, but all of that was only on 3 targets, 3 receptions. And unless the Saints can score 40 points a game and have over 400 passing yards, he's not going to be a consistent guy. The target share to yardage ratio should tell you all you need to know. He averaged 51 yards per catch. Now, he may be a very, very important part of this offense in real life football. Again, it doesn't always translate to fantasy, especially when you're not getting a consistent target share, when you're the 3rd or 4th option. Kamara's getting a 20% team target share as a running back. Chris Olave is getting the wide receiver 1 volume and targets. And then you have Michael Thomas and the resurgence of Taysom Hill and Jawan Johnson eventually behind him. There's a whole bunch of guys that need targets and not enough passing volume. His role in general is not a volume wide receiver. He's going to be that deep threat guy that gets targets sometimes. He gets really good 50-yard catches like he saw last week, but not a guy we can trust in our starting lineup unless you're in a 20-man league. Again, don't waste any fab or waiver priority on this guy. There's going to be people with more high upside and consistency throughout the season on the waiver wire that we can use for our bench. Moving down to another wide receiver that everybody has been talking about, is probably the top waiver wire add to a lot of sheep around here, is Demario Douglas. Do not waste your time picking him up off the waivers. If you guys don't know, he is one of the receivers on the Patriots. Kendrick Bourne just went down with a season-ending injury, and that is putting him as the potential wide receiver 1, 2, or maybe even 3. Who knows? Again, we have to ask ourselves, are we ever going to be starting Demario Douglas with confidence? And the main thing holding me back from answering that question yes is because of the unpredictability of this offense. He's going to have Juju, he's going to have Devontae Parker, and him as the top 3 wide receiver options. As of right now, I would take him as the main option in this offense to get the targets out of the wide receiver position, but at the same time, all of these wide receivers are about the same in value right now. But if Juju cannot be reliable, if Parker cannot be reliable, there's not much different about Demario Douglas that is going to make him a super good fantasy option. This is a guy that was drafted in the 7th round of the NFL draft. He doesn't have an insanely high player profile, and this offense just is not good enough to support a wide receiver startable in fantasy. If this was a guy on a super high passing volume offense like Justin Herbert with the Chargers or like Joe Burrow with the Bengals, I'd really be okay with it, but the Patriots are one of the worst offenses in the NFL. They cannot pass. Mac Jones is not very good, and this team is just a ball of inconsistency. We don't want that for fantasy, because if Mac Jones is only going to have 30 pass attempts a game and hover around 200 yards, he's going to have to get Ramondre the ball. He's going to have to get Parker, Juju, maybe even Zeke. There's a whole bunch of guys, Hunter Henry, that could be getting a decent amount of target share. Now, there is necessarily no wide receiver 1 or target volume number 1 in this team, and there is a real chance that he becomes that. But again, in the past years and historically, that hasn't meant much for the Patriots offense. The Patriots do have one of the better fantasy football wide receiver schedules for the rest of the season, so if you really are desperate, you can go ahead and get him. But if you do have him on your team, do not consider starting him anytime soon. Wait to see what you have. Wait to see how this offense operates. The next guy we do not need to be wasting our waiver wire priorities on is Leonard Fournette, and this is a guy that's again been very hyped up over the past few days. If you guys don't know why, it is because he just signed with the Bills, and you guys might be looking at me very confused because I've been saying we need to sell James Cook for the longest time. I don't trust this backfield, and that is exactly why I can't be trusting Leonard Fournette, even though I think he's a decent running back. Most likely they brought him on the team because of the absence of Damian Harris on IR, and Latavius Murray just is not getting it done. And James Cook is a guy that won't and has not seen over a 70% snap share this entire season. It's just not his role. So now they brought in Leonard Fournette, and some of you guys might think this is a sneaky good ad that you should be picking up, but let me explain why we should kind of pump the brakes on that. The Bills didn't add Fournette to be a guy that's going to get more volume or time on field than James Cook. He is a role player guy, and that role he's playing is probably the Damian Harris or Latavius Murray role, 40% of the snaps, maybe even less. But the reason I'm really not in love with adding this guy off the waivers is because there's no path to upside. Usually, again, when we add people, we want to have some kind of upside late season or value now. And because you're in a committee backfield with 3 other running backs, you're going to have a cap ceiling and floor for what you can produce. Will it even be a 4-man committee? We don't know, but it's definitely going to be James Cook, him, and Latavius Murray / Damian Harris when he comes back. I would way rather add a running back that has a path to be the RB1. And even if James Cook were to get injured, it is a committee field, so it's going to just be a committee with the lower level guys. Leonard Fournette will probably lock himself into 5 to 7 carries a game and a majority of the goal line work, which is going to be decent. But again, if we're not starting Damian Harris or Latavius Murray, Leonard Fournette isn't really going to be too different from them. Now, moving on to the quarterbacks, maybe you lost yours, you had Kirk Cousins, or maybe you just have a bye week. There's a whole bunch of good teams on bye. You're looking for a quarterback on the waivers, you're scouring. Do not let Will Levis be the guy you pick up. Don't get me wrong, he looked actually very good in his first debut for the Titans, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to be a good fantasy option. He came out here with 29 pass attempts for 4 touchdowns and 238 yards. Pretty decent day by a rookie's means. And he doesn't have the best fantasy schedule coming up. He does get the Steelers next week, which is a bit of a tough defense. And there is a chance that he's not going to be the long-term starter, so you'd be wasting fab or a waiver priority, a high waiver priority, hopefully not, on a guy that might be a 1-week starter against a defense that's not the most fantasy point friendly. I do think he is the best long-term option for the Titans though, but again, this is a run-first offense. Derrick Henry did benefit from Will Levis as well as DeAndre Hopkins, obviously, but this team is going to run first. They have Derrick Henry, they have Tajay Spears, 2 guys that are seeing decent snaps and target shares out of the backfield, as well as usage in the running game. But that's not his fault. This offense just runs a less pass-heavy scheme. It's just going to be restricted on that alone. There are better options out there. If we want to get Will Levis, let's make sure he's the starter, or at least has startable value later down the line of the season. Make sure this wasn't a fluke game. But that is going to end off this video of the top players we cannot be adding off of the waiver wire. If you did watch it all the way through, I seriously appreciate you guys, and I will see you guys in the next video coming soon.